Well, hello. My name is Mitchell Whittington, and I'm really happy today to be sitting next to my friend John Curington. We're going to talk a little bit about H.L. Hunt and his possible connections to the death of John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, and Jimmy Hoffa. And it's really a pleasure, John, to be sitting here. And, when we were writing this book, we were meeting about once a week at the Catfish place, and so I got to see you every week and talk to you and visit, and we hadn't got to do that in a while, so this will be really special for me. I do want to tell everybody that I think the thing that first caught my attention when John very first called me was the fact that there was one person, Mr. Hunt, H.L. Hunt, that had ties to all four of these murders. And John, I don't think I've ever seen one person tied to all four of these. Have you?
No, I have not.
No, I haven't either. So that just makes your story incredible to me. And in fact, it's not just that, but also the fact that you live this. I mean, this was your job, and I'm looking forward to hearing some of your comments on that as we go through today.
Well, I'm looking forward to it also.
Well, just to get started, I've made some notes to have some questions to ask you to kind of keep myself on track. But just to get started, how did you come to be the right-hand man to H.L. Hunt? Now, I'm sure he didn't put an ad in the paper saying, I need somebody that's my most trusted employee and I can trust with anything. How did you get to that position?
Well, your first question has disappointed me. I don't have an answer for it. I started to work for Hunt Oil Company in the 1953-54 time period, and after being there 2 or 3 years, I just was somebody called to Mr. Hunt's office, and I wasn't asked if I wanted to work up there. I was directed to work up there, and I don't have an answer to your question. But I had done some special works for his sons, Herbert and Bunker, and I think they told their dad that I had a reputation of getting things done, and Mr. Hunt relied upon their recommendations, and that's how I became associated with him. But nothing in my background would have suggested that I would have ended up in that position there.
But your office was directly next to his.
Yes, we had adjoining offices, and normally the door was always open. Mr. Hunt, his desk was an old-timey desk, probably 45 or 50 years old, but he had a small buzzer on it. Anytime he wanted me, he punched the buzzer, and I was there within 3 seconds there after the buzzer was appointed there.
Wow. So not much went on up there that you didn't know about.
I believe that I was privileged to 98% of all of Mr. Hunt's activities involving other people or involving his political beliefs and his interest in his business and his business empire.
Wow. Well, I'd like to kind of start out by going into some of that knowledge you have about his business and him by talking about John F. Kennedy, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. When did you first meet JFK?
Mr. Hunt and I went to the Democratic Convention in Los Angeles in 1960. The convention was taken over pretty well by the Kennedy family. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was there, his father Joe Kennedy was there, and his brother Bobby was there. Joe Kennedy was by far the most active and the most aggressive man at the convention. John Fitzgerald kept a low profile. Mr. Hunt and I were exposed to him on a very short period of time, over a limited period of time. But most all of Mr. Hunt's contacts was through Joe Kennedy and brother Bobby Kennedy.
Well, what role did Mr. Hunt play in the convention itself?
Mr. Hunt went to the convention with the idea that Lyndon Johnson was going to be selected for the presidency nomination.
Oh, not JFK, but Johnson.
Yes.
Okay.
Johnson's closest ally in Washington was Sam Rayburn, who was the most powerful political man in Washington at that time. But after we were when I say we have talked, Mr. Hunt and I were at the convention probably 24, 36 hours, it became obvious to almost everyone except LBJ that Kennedy's were in and Lyndon Johnson was out. And Lyndon just could not accept the fact that his reputation as a good politician and his knowledge of the government was putting him in that backseat position there.
Wow. Well, how did Hunt get him on the ticket and get that ticket elected?
I think Mr. Hunt had more influence with Lyndon Johnson than any other person on getting Johnson to accept the second spot. For one, the Kennedys didn't like Johnson, and Johnson didn't like the Kennedys. But Mr. Hunt was able to, in a what I call a soft sell presentation, convince Lyndon that the only way he would ever become president was he had to take the second spot. Then, for reasons unknown at that time, John Fitzgerald Kennedy would leave office under some kind of a circumstance, and Johnson would step into that position.
So that's what Hunt believed?
Yes. And that's the belief he conveyed to Lyndon Johnson there.
Interesting. Okay, well, they did get elected, obviously, and Mr. Hunt was still involved, I guess, behind the scenes with talking to LBJ on a regular basis. I mean, one of the things that interested me when I first started talking to you was we'd be sitting across from each other at the catfish place, and I would think, here's a man that could pick up the phone and get LBJ on the other end. You know, here's a man that actually talked to presidents of the United States, and you don't know many people like that, or I don't, so that was interesting. But I assume that you and Mr. Hunt continued that relationship with LBJ.
Well, Mr. Hunt's political decisions, although he had a reputation of being on what I would call a right side, very constructive political beliefs there, when it got right down to the nitty-gritty, he normally backed his support as to the person who could do him the most good from a monetary or business standpoint. And it was Mr. Hunt's belief that Lyndon Johnson would be an effective president, but more important, Lyndon Johnson would listen to any suggestion or recommendation that Mr. Hunt wanted to make, and that was his primary reason for the support there.
And that makes sense. Now, I know that there was something at the time that came up about a sermon by Dr. Criswell, who was the pastor of the First Baptist Church. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Back in 1960, after Johnson and Kennedy were on the ticket, Mr. Hunt came up with what I consider a very unique idea. He wanted Dr. W.A. Criswell to deliver a sermon on Sunday morning from the pulpit of the First Baptist Church in Dallas that, one, would denounce the Roman Catholic Church, and two, would renounce Bobby Kennedy as a Catholic running for office. Now, Mr. Hunt's theory was that this sermon would unite the Catholics against the opposition, and two, the sermon would, the pastors that would receive this sermon, before I make the next comment, Mr. Hunt we had the sermon reproduced. I carried the message to New York and had it duplicated and mailed to 200,000 Protestant ministers in the United States.
Wow.
So it was Mr. Hunt's theory that this message would unite the Catholics, but the 200,000 Protestant ministers that received a copy of the message, they in turn would denounce Criswell for making that speech from the pulpit, and then therefore he felt like he had a double-edged sword. And the sermon did turn out just as Mr. Hunt had projected. He and I were subject to being subpoenaed to appear before a House investigative committee. We were interviewed by the three different FBI agents, three agents at the same time. He and I disappeared for about a 4-month period of time where we had to avoid being arrested. The sermon violated a federal law which in effect states that if you write a article against someone running for president, you have to identify yourself as a sender of that article. And although I sent it, I did not identify myself, and thus I violated a federal law. And the first FBI agent that talked to me told me that I was looking at a 225,000 count indictment.
Wow.
And that sort of encouraged me to disappear for a period of time.
Well, hopefully the statute of limitations has passed on
I
it.
hope it has too.
Well, that's a pretty complex plan, but I guess that shows the thought process of Mr. Hunt and how he, had everything that he was working behind the scenes.
Well, pardon me interrupting you there, but at the same time that I mailed that mailing to the Protestant ministers, I had about 25 young ladies working for me, and we wrote a very complimentary piece for Lyndon Johnson. And we went to the public library and made a copy of that and mailed a copy of the Lyndon Johnson pro-article to every person in a telephone directory that had the name Johnson. And at that time, I was working with over 600 radio stations in promoting our Lifeline program. And I had those radio stations located in 600 different cities to send me telephone books from those cities. So we were denouncing Bobby Kennedy, John Fitzgerald Kennedy on one hand, but complimenting Johnson on the other hand. And Mr. Hunt single-handedly took credit, I think, for John Fitzgerald Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson being elected there.
So I guess at some point he kind of lost faith in that combination of the president and vice president. What happened there?
Mr. Hunt believed that Lyndon Johnson was a much smarter politician than President Kennedy, that Johnson could control Kennedy, and although he was in the second spot, by his political skills, he was able to accomplish anything that needed to be done. But it became obvious over a period of time that Johnson was losing his power, and Bobby Kennedy and John Fitzgerald Kennedy was gaining power. And Mr. Hunt always contributed Bobby's skills a little bit more than John Fitzgerald's there. But anyway, it became obvious to Mr. Hunt that Johnson was going to be dropped from the ticket in 1964, and therefore, in all probability, Bobby Kennedy would have also had Johnson indicted along with his bagman fellow named Bobby Baker. So it became obvious to Mr. Hunt in the latter part of 1963 or 363 that to protect his empire that John Fitzgerald Kennedy had to be removed from office.
Well, we know what happened there.
Yeah.
After he was shot, after President Kennedy was shot, was there any relationship that you saw between Mr. Hunt and Lee Harvey Oswald or the Oswald family?
Mr. Hunt, in his own personal belief, believed in the initial beginning that Lee Harvey Oswald had made the move that he did based upon derogatory comments that Mr. Hunt's radio program Lifeline had expanded against John Fitzgerald Kennedy. So Mr. Hunt.
So that's all the anti-Kennedy things that he had been doing that you were just talking about. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
So Mr. Hunt believed that if Lee Harvey Oswald ever went to trial and ever testified, that he would tie Mr. Hunt into his anti-Kennedy program, and therefore would be a very critical situation for him. And in fact, Mr. Hunt believed that he himself could be indicted based upon Lee Harvey Oswald's testimony. So on a Saturday afternoon, about 4:30, 5 o'clock, Mr. Hunt called me, asked me to go down to the Dallas Police Department and check the security that was going on around Lee Harvey Oswald. I did go down to the police department. I did, just coincidental, I got on the same elevator with Captain Will Fritz and Lee Harvey Oswald. Captain Real Fritz was a good friend of Mr. Hunt's, was a friend of mine. He introduced me to Oswald. We made no exchange of any words there, we just looked at each other. But Mr. Hunt wanted the security checked around Lee Harvey Oswald, and then I was to report back to him regardless of the time of night it might be. And I finally left the Dallas Police Department about 1:30, 2 o'clock on a Sunday morning there.
And you reported back to him?
I had instruction to report to Mr. Hunt back in person to his house on Walther Drive there in Dallas. At that time, he asked me if I would go to Joe Savello's house, who was head of the mafia for the southern part of the United States, and see if Savello would come over to Mount Vernon. That was Mr. Hunt's home, and which I did. I went to Savello's house about 2:30 on a Sunday morning, got him up out of bed. He agreed to go to Mr. Hunt's house. I think he got over there about 7 o'clock, about 11 o'clock, Lee Harvey Oswald was shot by Jack Ruby.
Wow. So that's very interesting. You know, we could go on and on about the ties between Mr. Hunt and Kennedy and the assassination, but I think that folks are also going to be interested in the aspect of Martin Luther King and Mr. Hunt. You had mentioned earlier about Lifeline. Could you tell us a little bit about that? Because I know that that was kind of played into the whole Martin Luther King story.
Lifeline was a program that was written and produced and distributed by H.L. Hunt at a personal cost of him of several $1,000s a day there.
A day?
A day.
Wow.
We bought all the radio time on over 600 radio stations. We had offices in Washington. We had commentators, writers, attorneys. We had an office in Dallas for the Lifeline program. It was a 6-day-a-week, 15-minute, what I call a pro-American program, and it was dedicated to, hopefully would influence people to cast a vote that Mr. Hunt thought would be better for the American people.
Was Martin Luther King ever the subject of this Lifeline program?
I believe that in looking backwards, that Martin Luther King probably had more derogatory Lifeline programs than any other person there. And J. Edgar Hoover and Mr. Hunt was in contact not on a day-to-day basis, but on a to-need-to basis. And most of them, not most of it, but a lot of material on Lifeline was furnished to us through J. Edgar Hoover, and it was very anti-Martin Luther King, and Mr. Hunt and Hoover and Lyndon Johnson all thought that Martin Luther King was being supported by the Communist Party, and all of his income and information that he was able to get came through the Communist Party there.
So we all know about James Earl Ray and the assassination of Martin Luther King. When the assassination happened, what was Mr. Hunt's behavior like?
Immediately after the assassination of Martin Luther King, and I believe that Mr. Hunt had word of the assassination within 10 or 15 minutes after the fatal shots were fired. The first thing Mr. Hunt did was call me and ask me to round up as many young ladies as I could, go down to our Dallas office and call every Lifeline radio station, which was over 600 stations, and ask them to not play a Martin Luther King program that was scheduled within the next 24, 36 hours there, which we did there. But right after the assassination, Mr. Hunt began to receive more threats from people who believed that he had an influence in the shooting of Martin Luther King. His home was out on Lawther Drive there in Dallas on a 12-acre estate, but he was receiving almost a continuous flow of telephone calls which were anti-Hunt and pro-Martin Luther King. There were shots even being fired over the top of his house, and Mr. Hunt called me on a Saturday after Martin Luther King was killed on a Friday night, and I made arrangements to get tickets in my name and my wife's name for he and Mrs. Hunt to go to El Paso, Texas, and I checked them into the Holiday Inn Motel there in my name, and I picked them up, went to the airport, and shipped them to El Paso. At that time, I'm sure a lot of 1,000 people had American Airlines credit cards, but I happened to have an American Airlines credit card that would enable me to buy tickets for anybody, anywhere, any place of the earth, and most American Airlines credit cards did not give that person that privilege there. But Mr. Hunt went to El Paso on a Monday morning after he got to El Paso on Saturday. J. Edgar Hoover called into our Dallas office, asked for Mr. Hunt. He was advised that Mr. Hunt was out of town. Hoover then asked if John was there. As far as I know, Hoover never knew my last name, but anyway, I did talk to him. He asked me if I could get a hold of Mr. Hunt and have him come to Washington. I told him yes, I could. I called Mr. Hunt, and he and Ruth left immediately for Washington.
Do you have any idea what the meeting was about?
I have no idea what the meeting was about.
That's interesting. And I believe also you had some interaction with James Earl Ray's attorney, Percy Foreman. What can you tell us about how he got involved and then what your interaction with him was?
Mr. Hunt, to my knowledge, had never had any direct contact with Percy Foreman, but he knew of Percy Foreman. And after James Earl Ray was arrested, and you have to keep in mind that James Earl Ray was not arrested for a long period of time after the shooting of Martin Luther King. But I think that Percy Foreman just sort of wormed his way in to represent James Earl Ray after he was arrested, and after the trial after preparation for the trial began, it was Mr. Hunt's belief that again James Earl Ray acted upon the shooting of Martin Luther King based upon his influence from the Lifeline radio program. So again, Mr. Hunt was under the impression that if James Earl Ray testified in trial and brought up Lifeline, he, H.L. Hunt himself, would be, an accusatory finger would be pointed at him. So I was in Mr. Hunt's office one afternoon. We got Percy Foreman on the telephone, and in conversation they exchanged a few compliments with each other. And Mr. Hunt stated that he had a young attorney that had a lot of ideas on some talking points for James Earl Ray on the trial there, and wanted to know if Percy Foreman would meet with me as I was a young lawyer with the ideas there. Percy Foreman said yes. There was no exchange of any information on do this or do that or any money exchange, but Mr. Hunt gave me $125,000. I left the next morning for
cash, right?
Yes, $125,000 in cash.
Wow.
I flew to Houston, caught a cab, went to Percy Foreman's office, walked in, I introduced myself to him. We talked about typical things of the weather and the Cowboys or something like that. And I just simply stated to Percy Foreman that I jotted down 125,000 reasons why James Earl Ray should plead guilty to shooting of Martin Luther King. Percy Foreman's comments, he looked at me and said, just leave your briefcase and I'll look your reasons over. I was in Percy Foreman's office, I'd say less than 7 or 8 minutes at the most there. And shortly thereafter that, Percy Foreman did convince James Earl Ray that he should enter a guilty plea, and that silenced James Earl Ray from any further testimony against Mr. Hunt or Lifeline.
Wow. That's powerful. I can imagine carrying a briefcase with $125,000 in
Well,
it.
back then, $1,000 bills were not illegal, so really in $1,000 bills, it's a pocket full of money, but you know you can still transport it without any logistical problems.
Yeah. I guess also back then they didn't search your luggage when you went on an airplane or anything like that. Well, you know, and the interesting thing to that, kind of the footnote to that story is, I think just a few days later, Ray came back and he wanted to change his plea, and the judge wouldn't let him. He said, I was talked into this, you know, which is exactly what you're saying. So that's an interesting footnote to the whole story.
I don't believe any member of the James Earl of the Kennedy of the Martin Luther King family, I don't believe any member ever accepted the fact that James Earl Ray was solely responsible for that. And James Earl Ray denied it from immediately after his guilty plea, and denied it, I think, to the day of his death.
Right. Right. I read not long ago that the King family still definitely believes it was more than just the James Earl Ray thing. Well, okay, going forward, we now had the assassination of JFK and of Martin Luther King, and you had an election coming up in 1968. What did Mr. Hunt think about the upcoming election and the candidates?
Mr. Hunt had an uncanny ability to predict in the future normally who was going to be elected to any high priority office. And his track record proved to prove him to be right more than he was wrong. But it was Mr. Hunt's opinion that Bobby Kennedy would be elected in 1968 as a nominee to run for president, and it was also Mr. Hunt's belief that Martin Luther King would be the second spot on that deal. And at that time, Mr. Hunt considered his two worst enemies from a political standpoint would be Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King.
Right, and then of course King was assassinated.
Yeah.
That still left Bobby in the running, though.
Yeah.
I know that he was campaigning out in California toward the end of his life. Do you have any trips that you made or anything like that out to California in that time frame?
I had hired a man at one time named Wendell Niles Jr. To be nothing more than an informant for, when I say me, I'm talking about for Mr. Hunt there.
Right.
As to any and everything going on in California that had a political climate to it. And Wendell Niles' job at this time was to keep me informed as to who Bobby Kennedy was meeting with, who was scheduling his appointments, how he was being received in California, and in the local people's opinion, how strong he was going to be for the nominee in 1968. And the reports we were getting did suggest that Kennedy would be nominated, and Kennedy would be hard to beat in the election there.
Did you ever go out there personally to California?
Just a few weeks before Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, Mr. Hunt and I flew out to California for a one-day, one-night visit. A little bit unusual. We stayed at the Ambassador Hotel at that particular time. That was our first time to ever go to the Ambassador Hotel. That night, Mr. Hunt met a man. I was not invited to the meeting or to the dinner. I did have dinner that night with Wendell Niles. We stayed one night in California and returned to Dallas the next day.
You had said earlier that you knew about 98% of everything Mr. Hunt did. Was it unusual for you not to be invited to that meeting?
It was unusual in a way, but usual in a, I mean, that's sort of a conflicting answer. But Mr. Hunt's personality was hard to predict, you know, and when he made a decision, I never questioned. I didn't say, well, why this or why that. It could have been unusual. In looking back on it, it was unusual, but I didn't read anything to it at that particular time.
Okay, in working on the book, a name came up named Mark Deering. What can you tell us about him?
Shortly after Sirhan shot Bobby Kennedy, Mr. Hunt wanted to send $40,000 to California, and he did not want me to take the money out there. But anyway, I selected a friend of mine who was also an employee, a fellow named Mark Deering. He came to my office, picked up $40,000, and flew to Los Angeles to deliver it to the man who I gave him the man's name. The man did not show up there at the airport. But another man did, saying that he represented the person that was to get the money. And Mark Deering called me and asked me what to do, and I told him no, not to release the money, only to the person that the money was supposed to go to. So shortly after that, arrangements was made for the man to get the money, but he wanted to meet Mark at the Ambassador Hotel. So again, I thought that was a little bit unusual, but anyway, that's where the money exchanged hands there.
A lot of interesting things going on at the Ambassador Hotel at that time.
And then shortly after that, and I don't have any explanation for this, Mr. Hunt wanted to send Bob Hope $25,000, and I was able to get the $25,000, and Mr. Hunt got it to Bob Hope. Whether or not there was any tie-in between those two payments, I don't know.
That is that's something to think about. You know, the person that wrote the foreword to the book is Dr. Cyril Wecht, and I seem to remember him talking about the fact that the autopsy that was done of Bobby Kennedy was much more thorough than the one that was done of JFK, and that everybody in the room seemed to say that the shot came from just 2 inches behind his head that killed him.
If you can believe a well-prepared scientific autopsy, then you have to accept the fact that Bobby Kennedy was killed by a bullet that was fired about 1.5 inches or 2 inches behind the back of his head.
If Bobby Kennedy had gone on to be president, what do you think would have happened to LBJ?
LBJ would have been dropped from the ticket in '68. He would, in all probability, have been indicted, just for the simple reason that Bobby Kennedy was always a strong enemy of LBJ. He didn't want him on the ticket in 1960. He didn't respect LBJ while he was in office, and enemies is not a good word, but they just didn't share anything in common from a political standpoint or an economic standpoint.
Wow. Well, I don't want to leave out the fourth person that you tie H.L. Hunt to in the book, which is Jimmy Hoffa. Now, it wasn't a public assassination like the other three, but Mr. Hunt did have ties to Jimmy Hoffa. What was his relationship to Jimmy Hoffa?
Well, something we did not talk on earlier, but the time period we're talking about, Mr. Hunt was often referred to as the world's richest and most powerful man.
Right.
As such, Mr. Hunt was the largest private employer in the world, was the largest private landowner in the world, was the largest producer of oil and gas in the world, was the largest drilling contractor in the world. So the unions were constantly trying to infiltrate Mr. Hunt's operations there. After Hoffa got imprisoned, Mr. Hunt's plants were still being visited by labor union organizers, but he was able to structure a deal with Jimmy Hoffa that, one, I'll get you out of prison and you keep your organizer out of my business there. That was the agreement that was made between the two men there. And of course there was money involved in that deal. And 48 hours before a man named Sidney Zachary, which was a union attorney in Washington, D.C., was killed, I delivered $125,000 to him at the Cabana Hotel in Dallas, Texas, and that was to be, I don't know who was to get the money, but that was to be the money necessary to get Hoffa out of the penitentiary. Sidney Zachary, after he got the money, flew to Atlanta, Georgia. The next day he went to Montgomery, Alabama. He went out to dinner that night. The restaurant caught on fire. Sidney Zachary, along with 20 some odd other people, were killed. No one ever knew what happened to the money. I don't know whether it was burned up in the fire. I don't know whether Zachary had delivered it to somebody. I don't know whether he had put it into his own bank account. But when Sidney Zachary got killed, everything shut down on getting Jimmy Hoffa out of the penitentiary. Mr. Hunt didn't know what happened to the money. He didn't know who was to get the money. He only furnished the money, but it was to go to somebody on that deal. But after Sidney Zachary was killed, Hoffa became almost uncontrollable because the delivery of the money was the last step required to get Hoffa out of the penitentiary. When Sidney Zachary was killed, nobody would touch Jimmy Hoffa. But Jimmy Hoffa became awfully impatient, and he was blaming everybody and everyone for that misfortune. And I think he blamed Bobby Kennedy more than any other person cause of that. But notwithstanding all of that, it did rock on for another year or two, and Jimmy Hoffa did get out of prison. Richard Nixon did give him a pardon, but rather than taking a nice, easy life, Hoffa again became almost uncontrollable as to statements that he wanted to make and allegations he wanted to make. So I think someone made the decision that it was everybody's best interest for Hoffa to disappear, and that's what happened to him.
You know, there's all kind of stories about he was buried at Giant Stadium, he was killed at this house, he was buried in that plot. Do you have any idea what really happened to him?
My best information, and it's nothing more than hearsay information, but it came to one of the key mafia people in Chicago, that Jimmy Hoffa was picked up, taken to a meat slaughtering plant, was thrown into a meat grinder, ground up into hamburger patties, including his belt, his boots, his buckles, and everything he had on.
Wow. Well, that would explain why they never found him, I guess. Well, that's certainly a fascinating look into Mr. H.L. Hunt and the power that he had. It's amazing to me how much money was circulating around all four of these deaths, and how he seemed to have ties to all of them himself. And I think, like I said earlier, that's one of the things that first interested me in your story when you contacted me. Was I had never heard one person, Mr. Hunt, tied to all four murders like that. But the more you get into it and the more you talk about it, there seems to be all these commonalities, including the money flowing around and Mr. Hunt trying to exert his influence and his thoughts and beliefs into these situations as well.
Well, I have just as big of mysteries and unanswers as anyone else, but from the beginning, from the time the fatal shot was fired against John Fitzgerald Kennedy up until the present time, and I'm not a reader of books. I've read my book and think it's a pretty good book. I hope others read it there. I'm not a reader of books, but in reading newspaper stories or magazine stories or listening to radio or TV commentators, almost without exception, H.L. Hunt's name is introduced into being involved in those 4 killings. But no one has ever followed up on it as to, was he involved? How was he involved? Why was he involved? How did it happen? So the book that you and I have written is a soft sell book there. I hope people will read it. I hope if they have any ideas, they can use some of my comments to support their comments. But I believe if enough people would get enough interest, if we could open up the case on these 4 killings, that I would have enough information to attract the attention of a grand jury.
Well, I believe that to be true, and I think that the most interesting thing about your book is you're not trying to come out and, like you said, hard sell. This is who did it. This is what happened. You're saying, here's the things that I saw. Here's the money I delivered. And I've gotten a lot of comments from people who say this contains a lot of pieces that fit together with my theories of this or my theories of that. And so no matter what people seem to think about any one of these deaths, be it JFK or Martin Luther King, the information seems to fit together like jigsaw puzzle pieces. And I think that makes it an interesting read. I really do.
Well, just to sum up our visit, I think the book title answers the question. H.L. Hunt had the motive and H.L. Hunt had the opportunity. And the next phrase, he had the means to do it.
Yeah, I think there's no question about that. John, I really appreciate you sitting down with me today, and I hope everybody's enjoyed this. The thing that I hope you carry away if you're watching this is that this is firsthand information from somebody who was actually there. And to me, there's a lot of power in those things. So I do hope that you get a chance to read the book, enjoy it, and of course, there's always the opportunity for us to delve even more into it, and I hope we get that opportunity in the near future. Thank you very much. Greatly appreciate you watching the show.